Okay. Well, can you still see me on my camera, guys?
I don't think we've seen you on your camera yet, so
Okay.
I think we're
Well,
we're
can
gold
you
either
still
way.
see me on my camera, guys? Apparently, I forgot to turn my headphones on, so hang on one more.
I don't think
Hang
we've
on one
seen you
second.
on your camera yet.
There we go. All right.
Okay.
I can
I
hear
think
you,
we're gold either way.
and you can see me. You can see me. I forgot to turn my headphones on.
We can't see you on the chat side, but we can see you on the Twitch side. So
Okay.
as long as we don't need speed, we're good. Neither of us are built for high performance anyway.
Hey,
Yeah,
look.
I'm not a hypervisor, dude.
As a gentleman of cherub demeanor myself, you get me going downhill, and I'm like a truck in neutral. I'll build up momentum all day long.
That's what I'm
When I
talking
was
about.
a kid, you know how like you used to roll down the hill?
Yeah.
By the time I was at the bottom of the hill, I was doing like 20 or 30 miles an hour.
All right. Well,
Wipe
looks like
out a family of 6.
my green screen is good. You guys, well, you'll see me on 10-second display, but honestly, my voice is going to be what's going to be carrying the questions and such to you all.
Yeah, don't do anything quick, and we'll be fine.
No. I mean, I might smile and laugh, as the audacious host that I am.
Nothing good happens fast.
Yeah, it seems unlikely.
All right, so let's say hi. D Forgotten, welcome. And D was asking about the miniature fundraiser that I was doing. I do have that going on. I should be getting a resupply of new mini boxes tomorrow. Fingers crossed. Though I still have the marketplace of the singles that are available. And that's at all times. Bro Applier, welcome. Dark Wolf, welcome to you. And some guy named Risky Luke. I don't know. He's here too. And
I heard that guy was a dick.
It's a bit of a lush too, from what I hear.
Risky Luke's all right, but Risky Business, man, that guy.
Yep, that guy, right?
Guy's not very nice to his pets.
No.
That's all I'm saying.
I'm even worse to my children.
Yeah, well, I've met your children. I totally understand that.
It's training.
God, you know what I just noticed, boys? There is a lot of good looking on the screen right now.
There is actually. I'm feeling a little outclassed, to be honest.
Oh, there we go. Hey, that's our website.
Yeah. I again, being an audacious host, I took the initiative to bring up your all's website because what I wanted to do in this first segment, since we're talking about I guess broadly Oktoberfest, though we don't need to address that necessarily as a cultural holiday, though you may if you'd like to. What I wanted to do is to introduce you two to the audience to discuss, you could bring up role-playing and whatnot, but we'll transition into that in a little bit. I want
you mean tabletop? Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
But I'd like you two to talk about yourselves, what got you into brewing, into doing this personally and professionally, or as a professional hobby, or however you're relating it. I want you to just open up about yourselves a little bit as we let's just sit at the table. I don't have beer with me, unfortunately. I forgot to go shopping, but I have a big pitcher full of ice water. So cheers to you here. But let's have a little bit of table talk first and discuss what gets someone into brewing, and then we'll expand from that in the following sections and talk about real life brewing and what is a brewer's kit in D&D or things like that.
Cool. Yeah, I think, Greg, you can back me up on this. We've both been sort of semi-professional alcoholics for the better part of our adult lives.
I switched. I switched my libation of choice about 6 years ago. Prior to that, I was very much I was a vodka and something drinker, and for a birthday.
I was a wine snob.
Yeah, and actually, technically, it was 2006, so it was 12 years ago. But I went out for a birthday dinner with some friends, and we went to a restaurant, and somebody thought it would be funny to get me a beer with more alcohol than a bottle of vodka had. And it turned out to be
amazing.
The first beer I'd ever consumed that I didn't think tasted like cat piss.
Yeah. Well, it was probably the first beer.
Well, it was
you ever had.
No, I drank a lot of beer before that, but it was the first one I ever drank and said, "Can I have another?" This was, and it was specifically, it was a Huygens brewery, a Dutch brewery, a beer called Delirium Tremens. Blue can, pink elephants, and they're dancing. And that's really all you need to know for the branding. That beer at 13.5% alcohol. It's a big, sort of a Belgian triple kind of beer. Flavorful and interesting and depth of flavor. And I sort of went, well, hold on a minute. Beer is supposed to be yellow and kind of taste like pee and make you burp a lot.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Kind of generic, like Budweiser and whatnot, or Busch.
Exactly.
That's what beer is. That's all that beer's ever been.
Well, that's all that beer has ever been in America. And I think that was sort of the beginning of my journey into beer, was understanding that I had it all wrong for most of my life. That I didn't really understand what beer was, because all I'd ever consumed was Bud Light or
Canadian
Coors or Canadian or Bud whatever flavor of the week, light,
or PBR, or
well, PBR was, you couldn't even find it when I was a young lad. But
and I still maintain that Coors Banquet's not a terrible beer.
I agree. It on a patio in the summertime when you're mowing the lawn, it's ideal. So that was kind of what happened. Was I had sort of been introduced to this, and then I went and started looking at beer. And so the following, 2 years later, at a birthday party, my wife told everybody to bring craft beer. So I ended up with 20 bottles of something different. And I realized that what I had built, this tiny little basket of, this is what beer is. She just opened the drawstrings on the bag of holding. That was what craft beer really is.
The seal was broken.
And I say that jokingly, because we're RPG fans here, but the truth is, in my mind, there is absolutely no end to what that can be. There is no end to what beer can be. It just hasn't been brewed yet.
I really like that outlook and attitude.
Well, that's what got me brewing, because I started to realize that if there is this spectrum of flavor, from the Bud Light to that Delirium Tremens that I'd had, to the ultra, nearly treacle barley wines that are out, to the big, rich, smoky, bitter, dark stouts, there's certainly a bit of variation to explore.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not great in the kitchen because I'm too lazy to clean up. But one pot and some fire, and I'm good. And I can make whatever beer I want. So that was sort of
funny enough, Greg,
that rolled.
That's sort of exactly my situation too. Is I was like, I've got a wine fridge in my house, and I was a really big wine enthusiast, if you will. And at a certain point, wine can only do so much. And then for some reason, Greg, we were affiliated through a previous endeavor, and Greg's like, dude, go buy this, and this.
Mm.
So I was like, okay. I bought a beer called Kentucky Bastard, which is like a 12% humongous, crazy ass beer, best thing I've ever had in my mouth, and like a Belgian or something like that, but a sort of a broad range. He's like, go buy these, these three styles, anything in these three styles. And yeah, I've probably had 5 glasses of wine in the last 6 years, because you can't match
beer works better.
Yeah,
And
beer
it doesn't
works
take
better.
as long to brew, if I recall. Yes.
Beer is beer can be as fast, depending on how you want. Okay, so I guess we should probably talk about if we're going to discuss beer in any category, we should probably talk about what it is and how it gets to be what we think it is. And if we do that, that'll give us all a little bit better perspective on some of the things that Luke and I are going to say, because we're going to say some things that sound a little unreasonable and silly, but there's a reason. So
we're going to use some words that don't make sense.
Yeah.
But,
so
beer has sort of got 3 stages, like broadly, and a couple of components. You've got your grains and waters, so your base elements, right?
Okay.
That would also include hops, and you combine those together with water.
You're watching too much Bon Appetit.
Yeah. Like, basically, brewing beer in a nutshell is making good tasting sugar water that an organism called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Did I say that right, Craig?
I'll give it to you.
I always screw it up. It's yeast. It's
yeast. Yeast. Yeah.
Yeah, and the depth of grains and hops and yeasts are almost without end. There's infinite combinations, and that's how the art or the real life RP of creating your perfect brew comes in. Is you combine those elements. So you've got elements, then you've got the sugar water, and then you take the sugar water and you introduce our little yeasty friends, and that creates your beer.
Yeah. So in terms of how long and time and things like that, depending on the desired product, it can be very, very short, or it can be quite long. So if we look at the traditional brewing of beer in Samaria and in Egypt 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, bread, so milled grains, which had yeast in them, were soaked in water, and then that was allowed to ferment, and that made alcohol. The combination of the bread and that made this nasty, soupy, like really, really weak oatmeal with alcohol in it. Back then, they used a grain called emmer. It's starting to find some resurgence now in the U.S., but it's considered an ancient grain, and it was a distant relative. Emmer's a distant relative of barley, so they're very similar. But the point is that they were extracting the sugars by soaking it in water under the right conditions. Go figure.
At the right temperatures.
It happens to be warm in Egypt, so that just worked to their advantage. And then it was covered and allowed to ferment for about 3 days. And then that liquid was poured off, and that's how the workers who built the pyramids were paid. They were paid because that was food. And it served more than one purpose. It served the purpose of feeding the slaves that were building the pyramids. It also served the purpose of hydrating them, because water is a lot harder to come by than people realize. We think about when we're playing, that 5e campaign or that 3.5 campaign, and grab a sip of water from the wineskin or whatever. I've got a bag of water. Where did it come from in an environment where this type of thing was not there? I don't seem to recall a lot of instances in D&D particularly where somebody was doing molecular biology, was doing invertebrate biology, was doing yeast culturing. Probably not. Beer existed in that time because the production of it purified it. And it was that
like
very
beer was the
water.
preferred beverage because the water would kill you.
Because you'd get dysentery if you drank the water, but you wouldn't get dysentery because the alcohol kills off anything in the beer or anything in the liquid. So, so there was that 3-day variation, and it was sort of a couple of thousand years during which the real purpose of creating that beverage was to have clean, safe drinking water that wouldn't make you sick.
Right.
And you got a buzz off of it, and that made you passive, and it wasn't high alcohol, so there weren't a lot of drunken battles, right?
To this day, there are still parts of the world that we live in where it's a practice to make the water not brown.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to boil the water anyways, you might as well throw some grain in it and have stuff for food and stuff for drink. So
and that's I think a really important thing to sort of grok. I mean, wine can be made in a few weeks if you don't want good wine. If you just want drinkable wine, probably 2 to 4 weeks, Luke, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Something like that.
Yeah.
If you want to not puke, you should probably 2 months.
Yeah, 2 months. The beer that I'm drinking right now, perfect example. This is a black lager. It could have been an ale. It doesn't make a difference in terms of making the beer, only what bug I feed to it to make me alcohol. But this beer was brewed on a Sunday night, and it was done fermenting 6 days later. And 2 weeks after that, it was in a keg, and now it's fizzy and happy.
Is that? Did you call it one Solomon Grundy?
Believe it or not, this particular beer, beer is named A Leaf on the Wind.
A man of culture, I see.
Yeah, we've been talking about that beer for quite a while.
Does it have a good burn? You know, like just like something in your chest, just kind of like
I specifically built this beer the way I did because Hoban always wanted to go to the black because he couldn't see the stars from his hometown. And that was where this came from. There's lots of little stars in there, and it's black.
The next beer that I'm brewing is the grain is sitting in the bucket just behind the camera, and that beer is called Replicant.
Ooh, so so it's not just fantasy again. We could draw the future into this, and it'll be. I think this is. I think beer, alcohol broadly, beer specifically, it is a part of our culture as human beings. Almost every culture embraces alcohol in some way.
Yep.
And with it being a part of history, with it being, it's mentioned in so many different religions and cultures, and it's something that it's just going to exist until we stop.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to its purpose in terms of cultural importance. It's culturally important everywhere. It's culturally relevant in all of these places, in all of these environments, and in all of these cultures because it served the same purpose. Whether you were Scottish Highlands, or whether you were walking across a desert, or whether you were mashing through a jungle, safe water required treatment. And treatment could only be achieved in 2 ways. Boil it, put something,
or add alcohol,
or put something in it that kills everything off, and that's the alcohol. There are beers made in Peru today and in Chile today that require the use of human sputum.
Oh, okay.
Because, if you think about the process that actually creates beer, it's a 2-stage process. You have grain that you need to extract sugar from into water, and then you feed that water to yeast. If the grain that you are using doesn't have an enzyme capable of making sugar from it, then you
got
have
one in
to
your face.
add that. And it just so happens women have lots of it in their mouth and men have a little bit. So what you find is in places like Peru, chicha is made with cornmeal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And women are the brewmasters because those women have the right enzymes to let the starches in the corn break down and turn into sugar. So even
Fascinating.
culturally, the type of grains that grow natively, the type of people that are responsible for manufacturing this product, it hasn't changed for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, there are greenhouses in Belgium that have been operating for 300 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, culturally, that's where that significance comes from. When we talk about going to the inn and asking for a flagon of ale, it's because nobody in their right mind would ask for a glass of wine.
Yeah. That's true. Magic may exist to some degree, or even some semblance of technology, but that creek running by the old tavern is probably also a latrine.
Beaver fever.
For people or nature, or
Yeah.
as you were talking about earlier, if actually, where I live in Sandusky, Ohio, there is a fantastic high quality limestone that exists under our soil, and that's due to the ice age and scooping out the lakes and all that other stuff.
Yeah, and as a Canadian, you're welcome for that.
Oh, thank you.
And you're welcome for the water that flows through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, we get Alberta cutters and all sorts of nor'easters, and you guys are, well, I guess you're to the west, but you're at least have the north part that you send down our way. Well, so one thing that the limestone can do, it can filter water over time. But something else it can act as like a watershed, right? It'll trickle down through the soil and then wash out. Well, when Sandusky, which we just celebrated our 200th birthday this year, when Sandusky was founded, a couple years after that founding, there was suddenly a cholera outbreak, or was it dysentery? Well, anyway, so what was happening was people were buried, but the water wasn't filtering down. Instead, it was going through the soil where people were being buried. The water was permeating the caskets, and then you had dead material being sluiced out into the lake, and people were fetching water from the lake. And so
that's gross as shit.
And so what happened was our area had a big cholera epidemic, and in fact, many people say that Sandusky would have been a Cleveland or a Toledo if it wasn't for that outbreak. And so what the city had to do was move the city cemetery from being like 200 feet or so from the lake, and they moved it about 1.5 miles, 2 miles inland to make sure that, because water is just that. Or look at we talk about in the Great Lakes the algae problem that we're having for various reasons. And that's absolutely correct. In a D&D setting, if you are living in a first world country where water is accessible, you don't often think about it because there's other alternatives. But when was the last time you ever did order a water in D&D? Or to go back one step, when was the last time you ever described your character having to take a pee out in the woods? Or to manage your waste? And where does that go? What does that affect?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing, and I said it, but I hadn't really given it a lot of consideration. But I mean, the water that we consume as characters, I think we completely take for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
we just assume that we have water with us, but it was never. It's either that or we have ale because we're playing a dwarf and that's what they drink, or we have wine because we're a E-word person and that's what they drink. But it's because there's this we make it a special thing. But the reality is that in a world that doesn't have, and you're right, there's magic, and I'm sure there are alchemists who know how to purify water, and I'm sure there are just smart people who know how to use carbon, layers of charcoal and peat to filter water to make it safe. But those would likely be few and far between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The average,
And it certainly wouldn't be done on a scale for every single adventurer in a realm to have an unlimited supply of.
Whereas a wineskin of young ale is absolutely possible, and probably preferable, because it would provide not only that, little bit of extra liquid courage, perhaps, but it would also provide that hydration, and it would provide calories. And low alcohol beers are sort of the common. 2 to 3% is sort of the typical ale that you would see 300 years ago, in terms of replacements for table water. They were called table beers, and they were used because that's what you would drink when you had lunch, because you wouldn't want to try and purify water just to have a sandwich. Right. And so farmers would take a jug of that out, with them on the cart when they went to work their fields or tend to the animals, and they would sit down with that at lunch, and that's what they would have. It was a bready sort of affair. It wasn't a traditional, clear, bubbly, effervescent. It was more like kind of slightly boozy oatmeal that was really runny.
Some people do call beer liquid bread.
And that's why, right? That's absolutely
Greg, I think we should touch on a little bit too. A lot of the RP experiences that I've had, the terms mead and beer are sort of universally interchanged.
Yep, for sure.
In RP world, and I think it might be beneficial if maybe we talked for a couple of minutes on the differences and why there's differences, and then we could touch on braggots too.
So that's sort of the three classes of typical agrarian alcohol prior to the age of distilling, which is, also a couple hundred years old plus now. But the differences are fairly simple.
Where you get your sugar.
Yeah, it ultimately comes down to where you get your sugar. So there's natural sources of sugar that we think of. What is the most common sweet sugar you can think of in nature? It's honey.
Yep.
And
honey.
So,
you go back to a lot of historical records, and mythologies and religious stories, and bees and honey they've been around.
They've been around for as long as. Don't have a lot of those in Egypt, and so in places like Africa and the Middle East, they used what they had, which was grasses. So it was grains. But everywhere else, a lot of this started with honeys. And that honey wine, as it's referred to now, was mead. You mix 4 parts water with 1 part honey, you let it ferment, it turns into mead. And mead, you literally can just put it in a jar, let it do its thing, and it will still itself out in 4 to 6 weeks, and you've got a 7% alcohol beverage that is safe to drink. Braggot is the next step in the chain. So in those places like Wales, for example, where grasses don't grow well, but they do grow. There are grains. Barley was one of the sort of staple grains in the British Isles for a long time. So barley was there, but they also had a lot of honey, had a lot of bees. They had a lot of flowering species in the rolling hills, particularly in Wales. And so the mead that was made would often be mixed with the beer, and it would create a beverage called a braggot, Braggot.
Isn't someone who brags?
That's a braggart.
Oh,
this is a braggot.
Okay,
so no R. In older text, it's referred to as a bragd, Braggwd. Yeah, and that's sort of the typical Welsh pronunciation. But they were a more table version of a mead. So you would feed a child a braggot, but you wouldn't give them mead because they would get drunk. But a braggot, you've got mostly beer and a bit of mead. So the mead provides the sweetness, and the beer provides the sustenance.
So think of in period RP. Think
Heather is actually Shlomo. Just to comment, Shlomo, heather is actually a very common ingredient in braggots, as is pepper, white and black pepper.
Huh.
So in RP, think of beer or ale as water.
Okay.
A straight 1-to-1 replacement. Mead is whiskey.
Mead is whiskey.
Yeah.
All right.
And
wine
and a braggot is sort of halfway in between.
Yeah. What is the one? What do you call the one with the apples? There's another name for an apple one when you mix a cider with a beer.
Terrible.
It's a silly name, and I hate it, but I can't remember it. But that's another way,
lambic,
right? No,
no, it's not lambic.
Bite your tongue.
Yeah.
To the internet.
You gotta go to the internet, man. Hey, we've learned a lot over the last 10, 12 years. I've learned a lot over the 10, 12 years. And Luke's learned a staggering amount in his last few years. I cannot remember what it's called. Somebody in the chat will get it.
When
go
ahead.
I was just going to say, but it wasn't very common in Europe because apple trees were few in number and tended to be owned by wealthy landowners. They weren't just random apple trees popping up in the forest all the time. And so, there you go. Look it up in that book. And so, a cider is specifically an apple or a cherry. In terms of those boozes, but they were much more rare, I think, compared to an ale, a warm fermented, and we'll talk about ales and lagers at some point through this conversation.
That's perfectly fine.
But they were traditionally a warm fermented grain beer, so wheat or barley, or they were a honey, and then the braggot mixed the two. So then you've got that sort of scale. And the way it worked was when a braggot was made, the first mix of that, which was the highest alcohol content, was
usually like
9%.
Used,
yeah, and it was actually used as payment for rent.
Yeah.
That is how most landowners paid landlords, was in alcohol.
And tribute to the church and stuff like that.
And tribute to the church and tithes and things like that. The second cut was used for guests.
Yeah.
And those guests...
typically like a 4
to 5%.
Yeah, 4.5%.
Yeah.
So you'd have the noblemen would be drinking 8%, 9% big beers. And so with the clergy. And then if you went to visit somebody, you'd get the 4 to 5%, and then, as Greg mentioned earlier, they'd run water through it one more time and do the process again, and you'd get your 2% strictly better than water that you'd drink all day.
Yeah, and that would be the table beer. That's what would be sitting in a jug on the table if you came in from work and you were thirsty, or if the kids wanted something to drink, because the alcohol content was very, very low. And that stems from the brewing process, right?
Yeah.
The brewing process. At the time, you wanted to get as much as you could possibly get out of that grain. So you would actually do a brew 2 or 3 times with the same grain. And the first cut of it would be really boozy, lots of sugar. The second cut, not so much. And the third would be much more watered down.
It sounds similar to there's some other foods. In fact, olive oil came to mind, where you have like extra virgin olive oil. That was the top. That was the first press, and that is the highest quality that the nobles would have been given or afforded. And so it's similar. It sounds similar in this instance as well.
It's killing Luke that he can't find the name of that drink, because we both know it.
I got pissed off when I looked up Party.
It starts with a G. It starts with a G, Luke.
Yeah.
It's not a. Is it a Groot?
Is it grog?
No,
we hear that with pirates. Grog and Rotgut.
It's not grog.
Grog is isn't that just really,
Groot?
really, really shitty sugar cane, not quite rum?
Yes. No, it's not Groot.
No.
Oh man, what the heck is it called?
Although I wonder if you could make a beer out of parts of Groot, how it would taste. It'd probably be pretty interesting.
I've heard it used actually because it's herbal. Oh man, what the heck is it called? Killing me. I mean, there's lots of shandies and things, and those are mixes of juices and beers. And
they're abominations. Don't do that to your beer.
Name for the apple thing. We'll find it and we'll bring it up at some point. But anyway,
because at least one of us isn't going to be able to sleep tonight until I figure it out.
Yeah, that's right. So society.
By the way, this is the reference manual for.
I apologize for my dog if you guys can hear her.
That's fine.
How to Brew by John Palmer.
Is that like 32 edition?
I've been in breweries that ship beer all across the country, and there's a copy of that book sitting on the brewmaster's desk.
So that is the core rule book for brewing.
Yeah. There are a couple of books that are sort of recognized by home brewers and pro brewers alike across the planet as being near biblical their
the Bible.
They're the DM guide, if you will. That's one of them. How to Brew by John Palmer. The other one is I've got it hiding around here somewhere. It's written by the.
No, dude, that's cool, Mnemonica. The cool thing about beer is it's not an elitist sport, and
far from
even a small bit of knowledge, like there's a really good chance, because the world is so large, you might know stuff that neither of us know, and vice versa, and it's about and that's part of the brewing of beer culture. Is you pass those things on. Like as a home brewer and a beer enthusiast, I can call up or pop into a local craft brewery. Some of them I know, or go to like a home brewers club meeting and like pop into a brewery and hang out and see their systems. And it's very hard to find a person that brews beer that's a dick.
You know what? You had published a video on how to make a home brewing kit. It was for $500. It was everything.
Yeah.
And I remember that phrase from the video that you sent, and I smiled and I enjoyed it, because even though I don't rub elbows in the brewing community, as I rub elbows in a gaming community or another hobbyist community or something that invokes creativity in people, you do find that there are people who are just more genuine or down to earth about their crafts, and they treat it as something they want to share, not necessarily as a competition. Because honestly, how can any of you say that there is the best beer out there? Because how many varieties of beer are there? Was it the best chocolate beer? Is it the best is it the best IPA? Is it the best whatever?
I can tell you what the best beer is.
So can I.
It's going to be this one right here.
It's the one that you've got in your hand.
The one you have in your hand? Ah.
The best beer is always the one you have in your hand. I think part of the reason for that, or the next beer, but I think part of the reason for that is that and without getting into the darker side of alcohol and its history, because there is a very dark side.
Empires were built on tax dollars from alcohol.
And empires were destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely. One's getting destroyed right now from it.
And fairly modern ones, too. If you take those sort of edge cases out, what you come down to is a beverage that is the common man's beverage. And I don't mean that to be,
mankind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is the commoner's beverage. And that means that in every inn and every farmhouse from coast to coast, north to south,
every
east and
building.
west, chances are there's somebody there who's got a beer and is willing to share one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, right? Is every
Easy, Shlomo.
homestead made their own beer, or their own mead, or whatever, their own, because they couldn't trust the water.
Mm-hmm.
So you could go into any within reason building that people existed in, and there would be some form of alcoholic beer beverage.
Which also, interestingly enough, and I hadn't considered this until now, but it also made it a beverage that wasn't expensive.
Very much not.
Because you could make it with very little. I mean, when you look at a batch of beer, 5 gallons.
Okay.
I did some research a couple of years ago with a malter here in Alberta, and we were talking about the amount of grain
exactly right,
grain yields from typical cultivated land. And you would need, for a 5-gallon batch of beer, so to make 5 gallons of a 5%, with modern brewing standards, which means much more efficient than it would have been, in older times, but not terribly far off. We would have seen efficiency of 50 or 60% starch to sugar extraction. Now we see about 80. 120 square feet is enough land to grow grain for 5 gallons of beer.
Oh.
Now, if you take that 120 square feet, how many 5-gallon batches can you get out of a mile by a mile? It works out to around 50,000 hectoliters.
Yeah.
So about 500,000 liters of beer.
Convert it to American.
500,000 liters.
You call that, we're talking square feet and miles, and all of a sudden, the efficiency of the metric system is gone.
Call that 125,000 gallons.
I personally measure my car's fuel efficiency and how many rods to the hogshead I get, but
agreed. Have one over there. Yeah. So I mean, a small patch of cultivated land makes an extraordinary amount of grain, and if you do that, you build that batch, and you're doing 10 or 20 gallons, and then I mean a typical barrel is about 80 gallons, 88 gallons. That 88 gallons is that's enough for 400 people.
And I think importantly too, the preservation, beer can keep without necessarily any refrigeration, right? So back in ye olde times, it was easier to keep beer longer, like to store it and put it away. Yes. In
older times, I would argue that hops were not used as a preservative until maybe the 1600s, 1500s, give or take.
Mid 1500s, Greg.
Yeah.
But the reason that the beer Stella Artois. Stella Artois was one of the first breweries about 250, 220 years ago that figured out how to keep beer fresh for 6 months.
Huh.
No. There were a number of herbs used prior to the cultivation of hops as a primary preservative. And even then, they were used as a preservative, not as a flavor additive. They weren't put in to make the beer bitter. Keep the beer longer. It's only over the last maybe 150 years that brewers have played with hops to make it more or less bitter.
And now hops is a sport.
Yeah, it's a sport.
A sport?
Dude,
who can make the bitterest beer?
Oh,
who can make the rip your face offest IPA? Who can put
the most repugnant tasting piece of shit?
It's okay. That's part of the game. That sort of is the other side of the whole concept of beer. Once you get past the fact that it exists as a beverage, then you take the next step and you say, okay, like anything else we put in our face holes, how do we make it taste better for us?
Yeah.
And that's where I think that's really the moment where you look at, okay, what has changed in beer in the last 400 years or 350 years? That is learning how to treat the grain to get different flavors, to get different efficiency, to learn how to create. How do you make a beer that tastes like caramel and one that tastes like chocolate?
Shlomo brings up a question. So, how do you drink beer in the winter in the Middle Ages?
It's indoors.
Yep. And you're still heating up water, so you're still taking the snow, and
still melting it over a fire.
All that you require isn't like, you don't require a perfectly freshly cut grain. Grain will hold up in the right conditions in the right situations. But even if you don't have a continued grain source, all you need is something that has sugar in it. So what you can do is you can create how do I explain primitive extract kits, Craig?
It's called honey. I suspect if you look at the places in the world where, and this is actually an interesting point, winter requires definition. Winter in Ireland is different than winter in Greenland. Different than winter in Northern Europe. It's different than winter in Central North America or Asia or, goodness, the equator. So is it possible to brew in the winter? Absolutely. One of the nice things about brewing, and this is something that people tend to forget, and most people who are unfamiliar with brewing wouldn't know it in the first place, fermentation produces heat, and quite a bit of it. If you had 10 or 15, 20 gallons worth of liquid fermenting, you could just about heat a home with that. Because it will raise the temperature of that vessel by 5 or 6 degrees centigrade.
Oh, there's some awesome questions.
Carbonation. That's an interesting question. Okay. Carbonation has existed since the day somebody had a vessel that could be closed airtight.
Yeah. So basically, our friends, the yeast that make the alcohol, they do two jobs. They eat sugar, and they leave one piece CO2 and one piece, it's not exactly that, it's like, but one piece CO2 and one piece alcohol. So what you have is, like Greg said, as soon as you could get a vessel airtight, the process of creating the alcohol also carbonated the beer.
Yeah. The last, the big change in the UK for carbonation, prior to the introduction of glass bottles, was what we refer to as a firkin, or a small wooden keg.
Okay.
That small wooden keg,
Isn't that where the term cask comes from?
Pardon?
Isn't that where the term cask comes from?
Yes. A cask is merely a modern adaptation of a firkin, or a larger one. Wine was made in casks.
Okay. 1/3 keg.
But what they are is they're an oaken barrel that is treated on the inside with flame so that it gets nice and hard and impermeable, and then tarred. Usually, they were sapped. So that the charcoal itself would be impervious, and then you would also have a sap lining to that firkin. And what would happen is the beer would be made, the brewing part would be done,
Eric,
put into the firkin, and those sealed barrels with, exactly, Derek. The coopers would manufacture these barrels to incredibly tight tolerances, and they would absolutely, under pressure and temperature, seal right up. And then when they were tapped, and we talk about tapping in the old days, that was a wooden spigot, right?
Yeah.
Those kegs were tapped two ways. They were tapped with a soft pine first, through a hole in the side of the keg. So that's why you have a hole in the side of those barrels.
Okay.
It's because those would be rolled to the top.
Okay.
And that would be at the top. It would allow you to sample, and it would also allow you to keep it sealed. When it was time to tap, you would pound a piece of thin pine into it that's fairly porous.
Okay.
It's called a spile. That spile would go in, and the excess CO2 would come out through the wood. So that would depressurize it. Because otherwise, if you tried to hammer a tap into it, the thing would explode.
Yeah.
Right?
I imagine that was a hard lesson learned by someone in the timeline of alcohol.
I guarantee you there is a bunch of medieval dudes with only one eye.
I have experience. I have seen it in the last year.
Oh, all right then.
This is still a very common way to prepare and serve beer. Most craft real ale type drinkers, and real ale is something we'll get into at some point, I'm sure, but real ale is ale that is fermented in a firkin or in a cask and then tapped to be consumed immediately. It's not, once that thing is open, it's open.
Okay.
You can't close it back up. You can stop the beer from flowing, but from that moment on, it's losing carbonation. It's going to go off. And so, even today, I've seen people with a hammer and a tap, and that tap doesn't go in right. There's 35-foot geysers of beer.
It seems glorious
when you're at an event.
It's extraordinary.
And it's a keg, a cask event, and somebody whacks a cask incorrectly.
Yeah.
And you're inside of a tent, and then there's like 8 adults holding a spewing metal thing and running for the tent door.
I'm not even going to talk about what you just looked like.
So rolling ones do happen in real life too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So anyway, those firkins are when the first carbonation really started to show up, and it did. It changed the way people appreciate the drink. It tastes totally, totally different. A flat beer that's uncarbonated is missing something very specific. Like Luke said, yeast do 3 things. They ingest sugar, they piss alcohol, and they fart CO2. It's that simple. That's it. Now, they imbibe other things.
Life on this planet would not exist.
Yeah.
At least in its present form, without yeast.
Yeah, absolutely true. And so, could it be done? Absolutely could be done without magic. The first coopers, that's 400 years ago. Barrel making was being done.
I just saw a thing recently that they uncovered what they thought was a maltery, which is how you get the grain to be able to make beer. That was like 6,000 BC or something like that, Greg?
Yep. Yeah, it would have been close to that, 6,000 to 7,000.
Yeah, and like there weren't, stainless steel pots and wort chillers.
No, it was clay pots.
Yeah.
Heated slowly to avoid them cracking, because they would crack with frightening regularity.
Yeah.
And then that beer would be packaged in pitchers, big, amphoros pitchers, like you'd see in old Greek texts and things like that. Those have been around since Egyptian times. And there was some discussion at one point. Patrick McGovern is a cultural anthropologist, and he did a lot of work discovering sort of ancient beers for lack of a better term, but they were made with grain, so they're a beer. And some of the work he did showed that they had vessels that would likely retain some pressure. It doesn't have to be much. Even just the process of fermentation will actually carbonate beer to a level. It's low, but it's there.
And you got to think like all that airtight has to be. Like you don't have to dive to 4,000 feet and have no air. Like it's the weight of the atmosphere three times is the super bubbly Budweiser that you know.
Yeah. Derek, that's a really interesting point. And an understanding of the technology. Matty, do you want to take that? Where do you want to take the next phase of this conversation?
What I would like to do, Derek beat me to it, and that's a compliment to him, because I think we were thinking along the same lines here. What I'd like to do after this segment, where we're talking intro stuff. You have certainly shown people that you know your stuff. This isn't just a lazy thing for you. This is a passion.
No, it's absolutely a lazy thing, and we're both stupid as a stick.
Well, then you know what? You have awesome charisma scores, brothers, because you're doing an awesome job. What I would actually like to do in our next segment is to go over with you all and say, all right, let's load up in our brains generic Western fantasy world, and there's a tavern.
Yeah.
Adventurers are here drinking ale or whatever, and what I want you to do is to go through the process of what does this town, let alone the world or culture, need, but what would you find in this town in order to put a mug of ale in an adventurer's hand? Because that ale didn't just appear out of nowhere. Well, I mean, if magic exists, but you're talking about grains and farms and all this other stuff. And so what I wanted to do is kind of build an economy and build a culture or a structure of a fantasy town that can serve an ale in an inn, and go over what would be there, right? If you're a DM and you're stuck, and you say, well, the common hook is we're gonna start the adventure in the tavern, and everyone's gonna have an ale, because that's just what you do in D&D.
Yeah.
You can come up with so much content, because the town is going to have coopers, millers. By the way, these are very common names of people, because you were named after what you did.
Really good blacksmith.
And so I want to get into detail in our next segment. A field and farmers, right, Shlomo? I would hope so, at least.
Those are a guarantee. I think that's an important point to note, and a good point to sort of finish up the really rough and vague. And by all means, Luke and I are available on Saturday nights. Come by and ask whatever questions you got that we don't get to. But specific to this cultural discussion of beer and the history of beer in culture and society, it has been widely credited. Beer, the beverage, or whatever bread-like drink you choose to call it, has been widely credited, and is very likely. I'd say I'd go so far as to say it's credible. The reason that towns exist is almost exclusively come down, and the shift from a nomadic lifestyle to a sedentary location lifestyle, an urban lifestyle, if you will, is 100% the response to a beverage that replaces water. In order to make
the reason that we stopped being hunter-gatherer is because we ran out of water, so we had to make beer, and we needed to plow and till fields to make the beer
and bread.
So we established residences by those fields for convenience, and then places to purchase the beer that was made, and so on and so forth stemmed. So it was the catalyst of how life stopped being hunter-gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To answer that question, Mr. Blunderfoot, yes, whiskey is liquid gold, particularly good peated Scotch whiskey.
As long as it's not smoky.
The very same product that I am drinking in my glass, if this had, instead of being put into a keg and tapped right behind me on that fridge with those taps, if it had instead been put into a still, it would be raw whiskey. There is no functional difference between beer and hard spirits.
Is when you hear people say
of the process.
Sorry to cut you off, Greg.
Yes, good Islay Scotch is a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
go ahead.
And Islay Scotch, or Islay, as it's most commonly incorrectly pronounced. That's just a region in Scotland where the Isleys, or we'll just call it the Isleys.
It's a special place where the peat is exceptionally thick and very flavorful.
Yeah.
Actually, whiskey without the E is only Scotch.
Yeah.
Everyone else is misspelling it. And I don't put a lot of. I'm not one of those arrogant whiskey people. I like, and you're right. It's Isla. I like a good Scotch, but I also like a good whiskey. And I do treat them separately, but I don't treat either with reverence. So
you know what I like is a good bio break.
Yeah, we'll take that. If I can throw out one last question to you, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
Absolutely.
Or
so. Sounds good.
So you all you've gone through this. You talked about your origin story. You've gotten together. You've done all this research. You've been brewing on your own. You're enjoying it. You're selling it. The name of your business is Rysky, Rysky.
Correct.
Can you get into, look, we're talking about names have meanings, and there's different meanings to different scotches and whiskeys and all this other stuff. What is the meaning to your name? And then we'll take a break after this.
So Luke, I'll run with this. this is all me. 5 years ago, when I started really actively brewing, I created a home brewery called Three Boys. Now, at the time, I was not aware of the Three Boys Brewery in New Zealand, and
they make better beer than you.
Yeah, they do. And I wasn't really sure of where I was going. When Luke and I started doing our live casts a number of years ago now, beer was a big part of that, and we both sort of had gotten to this point in our history where we both sort of said, you know what, if money was no object, if I had $1 million in my back pocket, what would I do for a job tomorrow?
And we both answered the same thing.
Okay.
Yes. What would I do for a job?
In Alberta.
Good night. What would I do for a job tomorrow? We'd open a brewery.
Yeah.
We'd hire somebody really good, and we'd have them as our brewmaster, and then we would be the mad scientists who came up with stupid ideas, and we would do that. And so, knowing that was something we wanted to build, we went, okay, well, how can we do that? Well, we can do that with YouTube. We can do that with live streaming. We can crowdsource. Let's see if we can make it happen. And we went into it with that intent. And so we created Rysk. And Rysk Brewing Company, the reason the name came up.
Dude, the Bat 50 is great.
Labatt's 50 is awesome.
I still drink 50 as Swasser. Fantastic.
Rysk is a Scandinavian word.
Okay.
This is where you lose me.
So when I looked at this, here's some hard and unpleasant facts when it comes to brewing.
It's really hard to get a 4-letter domain.
That too. 1 out of every 3 breweries that opens will be closed inside 18 months. Period. Full stop. End of discussion.
Yeah.
The average brewery in North America, outside of Labatt's, aka AB InBev, Sapporo, or Miller Coors, takes a minimum of 3 years to turn a profit.
Yeah.
That does not mean pay back the people who built it. That means turn a profit.
Yeah.
So if you want to build a brewery and you've got $150,000 in your back pocket, I can spend that shit inside 3 months.
Oh, dude, I could spend $150,000
And you will see it come back to
brewery.
you in 5 years if I do everything right. So creating a brewery is not only an act of passion and an act of love, but it is one big ass risk.
Yeah.
So back to the word.
Yeah.
So the risk was what I saw. If we were ever going to do it, we were taking a risk.
Yep.
RYSK is a Scandinavian word that means out of your head crazy. And the way I saw it, if you're going to do this, you have got to be out of your head crazy.
Yeah,
And
if two husbands and fathers could put together $1 million to do this, and we actually do it, we're going to be crazy. Like, we're going to do it.
But we're crazy.
We're crazy people.
So at this point, we don't sell.
But you got it right.
But we produce, and we partner, and we spend time with real brewers, and we work on recipes with real brewers. And if in a year we see our name on a tap that's got our beer that was made by another guy who we hang out with,
I will buy everybody in the bar
my beer
until that keg is empty. I'm buying it for people.
Yeah. So the long-term dream is to do this, to build a brewery, to create an actual product that we can sell and ship worldwide. The truth is, it's a really unlikely thing to happen. It is a specific set of circumstances that support that dream happening. Right now, I'm a father of 2, both of them under 13. Luke's got a little one under 10. We're not in a position to give up the house or risk it.
Yeah.
But we'll play the game, and we'll teach, and we'll learn, and we'll share along the way. And if
somebody drops a bag of cash out of a helicopter,
well, then we're talking.
It's going to get risky.
1/3 survive, 2/3 close.
Yep.
Yeah.
Those are. It varies industry to industry, but that's for almost anything you do. You want to open a restaurant, you want to open up a ma and pa store, a cheese, like a gentrified cheese shop downtown. You're looking at those numbers. The
big difference is when you're looking at production scale for brewing, you're going to spend $50,000 on the stainless steel to make one batch and store one batch.
When I was pursuing my master's degree in executive business management, my group studied Lagunitas as a business case.
Yeah,
excellent case.
And
some terrible stuff happened to Lagunitas.
It was very interesting, and you know what? The whole I don't know if it is a bubble or if it's ready to burst, and it has or it won't. But microbrewing or independent breweries are doing very well and have taken a big market share. But that's business stuff. I think we can take a 10-minute break though first.
You bet.
And then
sounds good.
Because hey, we have this next segment coming up, and we can certainly talk about that, because maybe this fantasy inn we're talking about is on hard times. And we develop a countryside and we say, well, how can we improve it or go from there? And of course we have tomorrow to continue talking about this. So everyone hang tight. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll talk fantasy more regularly than interspersing it in with what we're doing.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you guys. I'm going to take a 10-minute break here myself, and I will BRB.